There are some crimes Vietnam takes so seriously that if you're found guilty of them, you might die. Murder, rape, drug trafficking. Vietnam has some of the toughest drug laws in the world. But fraud and embezzlement, some white-collar crimes, are also punishable by death.
Vietnamese billionaire Truong My Lan has been sentenced to death for fraud.
67-year-old Truong My Lan was found guilty of embezzlement, bribing state officials and violating bank lending regulations. It's been described as one of the greatest bank frauds in history.
Her crime, siphoning from one of the country's largest banks hundreds of trillions of dong. That's the local currency, worth close to $17 billion Canadian. That's big. Like, forget Theranos, forget FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. This is bigger. The amount of financial damage she's alleged to have caused is equal to about 6% of the entire country's GDP. And what I didn't realize about this story at first is that her conviction is actually part of a much bigger story about how one of the fastest growing economies in Asia, some experts call Vietnam the next China, how it's grappling with a mountain of white-collar crime that could threaten everything. The crimes of Truong My Lan have been called one of the greatest bank frauds the world has ever seen. She was just found guilty of embezzlement, bribery, violating all kinds of banking rules. But how did she do it? How did she steal billions of dollars? Well, it starts with a bank Lan actually helped to create. 3 banks strapped for cash merged into one with her oversight to create the Saigon Commercial Bank. Now, she didn't own the bank. There's actually a Vietnamese law that prohibits any individual from owning more than 5% of a bank's shares. So, according to prosecutors, she very much faked her way into near complete ownership. Hundreds of shell companies and people acting as proxies on her behalf, altogether buying more than just a controlling interest in the bank. By the end, Truong My Lan owned more than 90% of Saigon Commercial Bank. And when you control 90% of a bank, you control its money. The accusation was that Lan appointed her own people as managers, who then went on to approve the equivalent of about $60 billion Canadian in loans to all these shell companies that she had set up. Those loans added up to about 93% of all the bank's lending.
This is the largest case of corruption in Vietnamese history. It's arguably the largest case of corruption in history.
How did she do this without anyone knowing? Well, that's the other problem. People did know. For example, her driver was accused of pulling out billions of dollars from the bank in cash over a 3-year period to store in Lan's basement. Lan was accused of paying bribes, sometimes millions of dollars at a time, to keep things quiet. In all, more than 80 people were tried and convicted on charges ranging from bribery to abuse of power in connection with this epic decade-long scheme. Lan's husband got 9 years in jail, her niece 17 years, and a senior bank inspector who turned a blind eye, life in prison.
The scale of this corruptions case is quite significant. It is not only, Truong My Lan herself as a real estate tycoon, but also along with 84 associates and over 2,400 witnesses and experts, have been called.
The victims in all of this? All those people who bought bonds from the bank, hoping to earn a little interest down the road, but who may now get very little, if anything, back. Police identified around 42,000 victims, and this is where we get to the heart of the story. The reason Vietnam's leaders want so desperately to make an example of Lan. The defendant's actions, read the judge's verdict, eroded people's trust in the leadership of the Communist Party and state.
The Communist Party leadership has built its legitimacy upon economic performance or performance more broadly, right? And the fact that corruption has been so rampant, so widespread, directly challenges its claim to this performance-based legitimacy.
Historically, corruption has been a real problem in Vietnam. One survey by the UN asked thousands of Vietnamese citizens about how corruption affects their day-to-day. 40% of farmers interviewed said they had to bribe someone for a land use certificate. 40%. A third of people said a bribe was necessary for medical care, and 40% of people said bribes were necessary at school.
It is a widely accepted feature, not a bug, of many systems, including the Vietnamese system. That stuff is accepted societally, not just in Vietnam, but in many parts of the world. But there is a clear difference between that and the egregious mass graft that we see in the high-profile cases under this Blazing Furnace campaign.
We've seen a slew of headlines recently about bribery and abuse of power during the height of the pandemic, when a flood of Vietnamese citizens abroad who were suddenly stranded raced to get home to Vietnam across a border that was all but locked down. There was good money to be paid for the privilege of catching a flight home. 25 officials were found to have accepted bribes, totaling about $10 million Canadian. And it wasn't just low-level civil servants getting swept up in that scandal over repatriation flights. Who was allowed to operate them, who was allowed to board them. The deputy foreign minister was involved too, and sentenced to 16 years in jail. For almost 10 years now, the current leader of Vietnam, Communist Party Secretary General Nguyen Phu Trong, he's made rooting out corruption a matter of political survival.
If you look at Vietnam's current political climate, what we see instead is a period of high degree of political fluctuation, a high degree of political factionalism. That, in fact, can really cause the question how stable politically Vietnam is.
Much of Truong's reputation is built around this campaign called Blazing Furnace, cracking down on corruption. To date, 2 presidents and 2 deputy prime ministers have been forced to resign. Hundreds of officials either disciplined or jailed.
Vietnam's second president in just over a year has quit. Vo Van Thong, the youngest president in the country's history, took charge last March after the sudden dismissal of his predecessor over corruption charges.
According to one research group, over the past decade, nearly 200,000 party members, including 36 Central Committee members and 50 military and police generals, have been disciplined. She is just the latest casualty in a much broader war, and at a very peculiar time. I mentioned earlier how Vietnam is sometimes called the next China. Well, just look at its GDP numbers alone. In 2019, $334 billion. That was an increase of 8% over the previous year, 2018. In 2020, up 4% from the previous year. 2021, up 6%. 2022, up 12%. And most recently, 2023, up 5%. Vietnam has also attracted big foreign investment. Apple and its suppliers, for example, have looked for alternatives to manufacturing in China. So companies like Foxconn, which makes iPhones and iPads, are building factories and hiring tens of thousands of people at a time in Vietnam.
They benefit in a lot of ways. They benefit from cheaper labor in some of these countries that they're moving to. They benefit from being insulated from some of the geopolitical tensions that come with operating in China and continuing to expand in China.
But with more wealth flowing, the more money you need to keep things moving. This is Vietnam's predicament. How to tamp down on corruption, on a society that has had corrupt practices rooted in for so long without grinding everything to a halt.
The anti-corruption campaign has been so widespread, and perhaps that's because corruption was so widespread, but it's been so widespread that it has now provoked an atmosphere of fear, not just among Vietnamese business people and foreign investors, but also among Vietnamese bureaucrats. Everybody seems afraid to make decisions lest they be caught up for bad behavior. And so red tape has become just huge. It has immobilized decision making. And so many projects that were supposed to be underway are just going nowhere fast.
Vietnam's so-called trial of the century, which may result in the death of a billionaire, is, in a lot of ways, just the beginning of a much longer story. For one, she plans to appeal, so her case isn't done yet. But she will likely not be the last prominent person to go on trial.